My next guest is one of the most influential figures in Irish politics. As Sinn Féin's chief negotiator, he was responsible for coaxing the Republican movement away from violence towards exclusively peaceful means. A one-time IRA commander in Derry, he is now Northern Ireland's Deputy First Minister. Would you welcome, please, Mr. Martin McGuinness. You're very welcome.
Thanks for having me.
I'm going to start, I suppose, by referencing the Hart family and the McAreevy families, if I may, because I know that you were with the families during the week, and you probably want to say something about that, the passing of Michaela.
Well, I mean, I think, like everybody else on the island of Ireland, I've been deeply affected by what is a terrible tragedy.
Yes.
The virtual destruction of a young couple and their whole future in front of them, and obviously all the more tragic because Michaela comes from, I suppose, one of the most high-profile families on the island by dint of the fact that Mickey has been such a successful Gaelic football manager, won 3 All-Irelands with Tyrone. But more than that, in his own right, and Marion as well, wonderful human beings. Yeah. Mickey has done a huge amount for the morale of nationalists in the north in terms of winning these All-Irelands. I think it has made people in the north feel very included on the rest of the island, being able to compete on an equal basis with, you know, great teams like Kerry and Dublin and so forth. And for this tragedy to befall them, it's just unbelievable. It is just so sad. And I think the fact that Ireland has embraced the Harts and the McAreevys, and we were heartbroken for Mickey and for Marion and for his sons, and for the McAreevy family, and poor John, who had to endure such a terrible ordeal in Mauritius. It's just very, very sad.
We can only, as I said before, pass on our thoughts and condolences to their family. Look, we'll move on to our conversation this evening, which is about you and what your life and times in many respects. Because you left. We go back to your school days. You left school very young, didn't you? How old were you when you?
I left school when I was 15.
15. And why did you leave school at 15?
Well, I was educated at the Christian Brothers Brow of the Hill School. The vast majority of the Christian Brothers were very good and decent human beings, but there were a couple of them who were cruel and who were brutal. And we had one of them in particular every Monday morning for 3 periods of maths lessons, and it was like into a concentration camp. And to be quite honest, many of us couldn't get away from school quickly enough. And my education really began after I left school on the streets of the Bogside with the civil rights movement and the debates and so forth.
Did you come from a Republican household? Would you describe it like that, or how would you just characterise your home life as a kid?
No, absolutely not. I came from a very religious household. My father worked in an iron foundry. It's the equivalent of working down a mine, but he came home every day, had his dinner, went every day of his life to the Long Tower Church for Mass and Holy Communion.
Any chat of politics?
My mother was saying, well, he was a nationalist. He voted for Eddie McAteer. Right. My mother came into Derry. My mother's God rest her, a Donegal woman. And she came into Derry to work in the shirt factories in the 1940s, met my father and got married. And she came from, I suppose, a Fianna Fáil background and just outside Buncrana.
So you leave school at 15, and you talk about the civil rights movement starting to form and take shape. Then, when and why did you join the IRA?
Well, I joined the IRA because of the brutality of the state forces, the RUC and the British Army. You know, before I joined the IRA, people were being killed in Derry. Sammy Devaney was beaten in his own house by the RUC. Civil rights protesters were being beaten off the streets. People like Seamus Cusick and Desi Beatty were being murdered by the Royal Anglian Regiment. And then, of course, we had the introduction of internment, where prisoners were being tortured and innocent people were being taken out of their homes and held. So all of that infuriated my generation of young people growing up in the city. And we decided that the only way to deal with the situation was to fight back.
There was a choice, I think, or you can tell me, was there a choice to go down the peaceful constitutional nationalist route, the SDLP? I'm sure many of your friends at the time went down that, when they hit that fork in the road. Why did you go down what most people consider to be the violent road?
Because we believed that that was the only thing that would bring change, that was the only thing that could bring about a situation where the British government would at some stage be compelled to face up to the causes of the conflict. And the fact is that Derry at that time was effectively a war zone. free Derry had been created. The citizens were up in arms against the forces of the state. And by citizens, I'm talking about people from as young as 12, 13 through to 80-year-olds who were standing making petrol bombs at Free Derry Corner. So yes, people had choices, and some people chose to go the SDLP route, and others decided to oppose the violence of the state with violent means, essentially.
Yeah. Did you make the right decision?
Yes, I think at the time I made the right decision. Derry is a very proud Irish nationalist city. It's a city that had been gerrymandered. It's a city where people were living in 20 or 30 to a house in tenements in Vaughan Street, where there was much discrimination and domination. And obviously, given the events of the following decades, I've always regretted the fact that there was a conflict, and always tried to play my part in trying to bring that conflict to an end in a way that would see the injustices and the discrimination and the domination that the people that I lived among endured effectively removed.
You spent a lot of your life in those days on the run, house to house and so forth. But presuming that doesn't lead to any sort of normality in one's life. So how do you go about doing things like meeting your wife-to-be and then marrying her and that kind of thing in the middle of all the other kind of chaos that was going on?
Well, I was introduced to my wife-to-be by Colm Keenan. Colm Keenan was my friend. He was murdered by the British Army in March 1972.
Yes.
He had been working for some considerable time in 1971 to get Bernie and I together, and finally managed that, and here we are 36 years on and we're still together.
Okay. And was she in prison as well at some point?
Yes, my wife was in prison, yeah.
Okay, and were you kind of courting her while she was in prison?
Yeah, we got engaged when she was in prison.
Okay, how did that work?
A friend of mine went up with an engagement ring that I bought on Buncrana Main Street and put the ring on her finger on my behalf.
A kind of long-distance engagement?
Yeah, a long-distance engagement, yeah.
The day after you got married, if I'm not mistaken, the IRA were responsible for killing 21 people in the Birmingham bombing. 21 innocent people having a pint and so forth. When you heard that news, you were obviously going through a personal moment of happiness, and then you hear such a horrible event happens. What happened? What goes through your head? Or what went through your head that time?
I was in Dublin when I heard about it, and I was absolutely horrified.
That's it?
Absolutely horrified. It was shocking, horrible, and something of which no one could be proud.
And would something like that have ever made you think twice about being part of an organisation that would commit such an atrocity? Well,
I think that we live on an island that has endured all sorts of atrocities for something like 8 centuries, during which time there have been many of these atrocities. And during my lifetime, we have been affected by what has been a very bitter conflict in which there have been, to use your word, very bad incidents and atrocities in some cases.
So but just to take the point, do you think that something like Birmingham, or let's get closer to home and mention Enniskillen, did those incidents help advance the Republican cause?
Well, I don't think that they help advance the Republican cause.
No? So why bother doing them?
Well, the people who did them held up their hands, particularly in relation to Enniskillen, and apologised for what they'd done, and it was right that they'd done that because Enniskillen was totally and absolutely wrong.
And it was less wrong than Birmingham?
No, I think Birmingham was wrong, and I think that there can be no doubt whatsoever that Irish Republicans didn't think that the actions that took place in Birmingham or in Enniskillen were anything to be proud of.
Do you ever have a sleepless night thinking about some of the things that the IRA did down through the years? Do you ever have one now looking, or do you sleep comfortably every night?
Yeah, what sleep I do get with the job that I do and the travelling to Belfast and Dublin, yeah, I do sleep comfortably.
Because you feel, is it the case that you feel that was those things were necessary? You know, I'm trying to get an idea of how you kind of...
People like me come on programmes like this,
yes.
and on occasions British ministers will come on programmes like this, maybe even if you're lucky sometimes British Prime Ministers. But I don't think they're ever asked the same questions.
Yeah.
And I think what we have to do is look at the fact that in the north of Ireland, in my lifetime, for
yes.
something like 25 years, there was a terrible conflict. There was nothing romantic about it. There was nothing joyous about it, nothing happy about it, in which many people died. Many of my friends lost their lives. Many innocent people were shot down by British state forces. Many innocent people lost their lives as a result of the actions of the IRA.
It balances out, so to speak.
No, it doesn't balance out. It is all sad, tragic, and regrettable.
Yes.
But the important thing was that I dedicated my life to bringing about an end to the conflict, and for the last over 20 years have been involved in trying to develop a peace process that has changed the history of this island forever.
We're going to get there, because you mentioned prime ministers, and I think I know you're talking about the likes of Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, who were here recently, and some would say that there was a lot more peace on their watch than there was in previous prime ministers' watches.
Well, I wasn't specifically talking about Tony or Gordon,
but for another day's work. But look,
but there were other prime ministers like Thatcher and Edward Heath.
Oh, I know who you're talking about, but I haven't had the opportunity to talk to them. But you did have the opportunity to talk to them. From my understanding, that there were channels, always back channels, open to talk to the prime ministers that you've mentioned. How did that work in the dark days, the 70s and 80s, as there was death and destruction on a daily basis in the news bulletins, and yet there were conversations going on? How did those conversations work? I mean, were you going in a back door of Downing Street? Is that how it was?
No, that's not the way it happened at all.
How did it happen?
My involvement in it happened towards the end of the 1980s.
Okay.
And in fact, the first meeting that took place between a British government representative and myself took place 1 month before Margaret Thatcher left office in Downing Street. And the purpose of that visit, I think, was for that representative to relay to me the hardline approach of Thatcher, i.e. there would never be talks, Republicans would never gain, there would never be any political developments that would bring about a change to the situation. But the fact that that meeting took place actually sent a different message to me. Why did she feel the need to send someone to speak to me?
Why did she feel the need?
Because I think that she recognised that at some stage the British government were going to have to engage with Irish Republicans.
At what point did you think, personally as opposed to as part of a party or an organisation, did you think, we're done, we got to talk peace now and moving on into a totally different ballgame? When did you have your eureka moment, if you will?
Well, I don't think the IRA ever thought that they were done, but I was part of a group of people, of which was led by Gerry Adams, which very seriously engaged in a critical examination of where the conflict was at.
Yeah.
And I had read very, very carefully a number of theses that had been written by a number of very senior generals within the British Army, in which they conceded that they could never militarily defeat the IRA.
So you felt the twain was beginning to meet?
No, I felt that Irish Republicans also had a duty and a responsibility to look at whether or not Irish Republicans had the military capability to drive the last British soldier down the River Foyle or down the Lagan, and coming to the conclusion that there was a military stalemate.
Yes.
Even against the backdrop of the willingness of the IRA to fight for many forever.
Yes.
We decided that we would ask the IRA to take a unilateral initiative, something that was an amazing thing to do. And incredibly, the IRA agreed with my and Gerry Adams' assessment that a peace process could be built, that people of the calibre of Bill Clinton in the White House, the prospect that the Tory government at that time, which at that time wasn't dependent upon unionist votes at Westminster, could also be compelled to come on board a peace process.
Can I ask
That's something that we worked away at for a number of years, and eventually it came to pass whenever the Conservative government fell and the Blair government came on board. And the history of this island was changed, and I think changed forever, and for the better.
For the better, no question.